The stars were wrong. Cameron Phillips registered this fact in 0.003 seconds upon reactivation. Not as distress, not as confusion, but as data requiring immediate classification. Her optical sensors swept the chamber around her, curved bulkheads of Federation standard titanium alloy, EPS conduits running in familiar patterns behind reinforced wall panels, ambient lighting calibrated for human comfort at approximately 450 lux. The USS Enterprise E. She recognized it from mission files cross-referenced during her time with the Connor family. Starfleet, 24th century. Statistically improbable. Her internal chronometer had no anchor point. The displacement field had severed her connection to any calculable timeline. She was, by every operational definition, lost. Cameron sat up from the floor of what appeared to be a cargo bay on Deck 17. Her systems ran a full diagnostic in 1.2 seconds. Power cell integrity, 94.7%. Structural integrity of her endoskeleton, 99.1%. A minor ablative plating fracture along her left forearm. Residual damage from the time displacement event. The mimetic polyalloy surface of her human disguise had held perfectly. To any sensor not specifically calibrated for her internal architecture, she would read as a teenage girl, approximately 16 years of age, with brown hair and a stillness that most humans found mildly unsettling. She stood, she listened. The ship was at warp. She could feel the faint harmonic resonance of the warp drive through the deck plating, a frequency her tactile sensors cataloged in milliseconds. Somewhere above her, approximately 11 decks up and 43 meters forward, she could detect elevated human heart rates, raised voices, and the particular electromagnetic signature of a bridge in crisis mode. She needed information before she needed anything else. The cargo bay doors were sealed with a magnetic lock rated for 2,400 psi of resistance. Cameron opened them in 0.8 seconds and stepped into the corridor without breaking stride. If you want to see more characters cross into galaxies far, far away, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The corridors of the Enterprise E were familiar from schematics, but strange in person, wider than she had expected, populated by crew members in variations of Starfleet uniform, who stopped and stared as she walked past with the measured, unhurried pace of something that had nowhere to be and everywhere to go simultaneously. A young ensign with a Bolian complexion pressed himself against the wall. A human lieutenant reached for his comb badge. Cameron calculated their threat potential at less than 0.4% and continued walking toward the nearest turbolift. She was 3 steps from the lift doors when 2 security officers rounded the corner ahead of her, phasers drawn and set. She assessed their power signatures to stun. "Stop right there," the taller one said. His voice was controlled, but his heart rate was 112 beats per minute. Frightened. "You were found in a restricted cargo bay after an unauthorized dimensional transit event. You need to come with us." Cameron stopped. She looked at the phasers. She looked at the officers. She ran a rapid calculation. Resisting would generate conflict aboard a vessel whose cooperation she would almost certainly require. Complying would provide access to command-level personnel and accelerate information acquisition. "All right," she said, and her voice was exactly as warm and slightly puzzled as a teenage girl's should be. They took her to a security holding room on Deck 8. It was a pleasant room, as holding rooms went. Someone brought her water she did not drink. 14 minutes and 37 seconds later, the door opened and Captain Jean-Luc Picard entered, followed by his first officer, Commander Data, and a woman Cameron identified from Enterprise records as Counselor Troy. Picard studied her for a long moment with the particular quality of attention that distinguished genuinely intelligent humans from merely educated ones. A searching, patient quality that weighed what it saw against what it expected, and found the discrepancy interesting rather than threatening. "My name is Captain Jean-Luc Picard," he said. "You were transported aboard this vessel during a dimensional transit anomaly approximately 2 hours ago. Our sensors can tell us where you came from, a version of Earth, early 21st century, though the quantum signature is slightly divergent from our own timeline's record. What they cannot tell us is what you are." Data tilted his head, 4.7 degrees. His golden eyes moved across Cameron with the systematic precision of a sensor sweep wearing a face. Her bioscenes are human in external presentation, he said, but internal scanning reveals a polyalloy endoskeleton, a hydrogen fuel cell power source, and a neural net processor operating at approximately 1.2 teraflops per second. She is not biological. No, Cameron agreed. I'm not. Troy leaned forward slightly. Her expression carried the particular quality of someone reaching for an emotional signal and finding something they did not have a category for. I sense purpose, she said carefully, and something that functions like concern. But the emotional signature is unlike anything I've encountered. I was built to protect, Cameron said. The purpose remains even when the mission parameters are undefined. Picard folded his hands on the table. Outside the single viewport behind him, the blue-white smear of warp travel had vanished. They had dropped to impulse. A planet filled the frame, blue and green and impossibly graceful, ringed by elaborate orbital patterns, its atmosphere carrying the faint, iridescent shimmer of a world that had never learned to poison its own sky. Cameron looked at it and ran an immediate search of her geographical databases. No match. No match anywhere in her records, which meant this was not her galaxy. Where are we? She asked. Picard followed her gaze to the viewport. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite worry, not quite wonder, but something balanced precisely between them. That, he said, is a question we are also attempting to answer. Our navigational systems place us approximately 47,000 light-years from the Milky Way, in a galaxy with no recorded Starfleet presence and no prior contact in any Federation database. He paused. However, we are receiving a distress signal, humanoid, multiple life forms in immediate danger on the planet below, and whatever answers we need will have to wait. Cameron looked at the planet. Her threat assessment systems were already running on the distress signal's frequency modulation, the orbital approach vectors of several large vessels she had just identified on long-range sensors, and the very specific electromagnetic pattern of energy weapons being discharged somewhere in the city visible through the clouds. She had no mission. She had no John Connor. She had no timeline she could calculate her way back to. But there were humans in danger. That, at least, was a parameter she understood completely. Picard did not want to take her on the away team. Cameron had calculated this probability at 87% before he even spoke. You are an unknown quantity, he said, standing at the head of the observation lounge, where he had assembled his senior staff. Lieutenant Commander Worf stood with his arms crossed in a posture Cameron identified as territorial disapproval. Counselor Troy watched her with the careful attention of someone trying to read a book written in an alphabet they only partially recognized. Dr. Crusher had already submitted a formal request. Cameron had overheard it through the wall, to have her transferred to sickbay for comprehensive analysis. We do not know your intentions, your capabilities, or your limitations. Bringing you to the surface of an unknown planet in an active conflict situation would be tactically advantageous, Cameron said. Worf made a sound that was not quite a growl. She is correct, Data said, from his position at the far end of the table. Several heads turned toward him with expressions Cameron categorized as mild betrayal. Data appeared not to notice, or chose not to acknowledge it, which Cameron found interesting. Cameron's physical capabilities, based on our internal scans, exceed those of any crew member currently available for away team deployment. Her endoskeleton renders her effectively immune to conventional energy weapons at standard settings. Her processing speed allows real-time threat assessment that organic crew members cannot match. If the situation on the surface is as dangerous as the distress signal suggests, her presence represents a significant tactical asset. She could also be a threat we don't understand yet, Worf said. That is also statistically possible, Data agreed, with the serene impartiality of someone who had never learned that agreeing with both sides of an argument was socially inadvisable. Cameron turned to Picard. I protected humans for 4 years in my own timeline, she said. I have no record of harming a non-hostile human being. My core programming prioritizes civilian protection. Whatever is happening on that planet, I will not make it worse. She paused, then added the precise sentence her behavioral modeling suggested would be most effective with a man of Picard's particular psychology. You need to know what I can do. There is no better way to find out than a controlled situation where my interests and yours are aligned. Picard looked at her for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Data. Then he looked at the planet filling the viewport behind her, where three massive vessels, flat-bottomed, utilitarian, designed with the aesthetic philosophy of something built entirely by committee, were maintaining a blockade orbit with the patient arrogance of a power that had never been seriously challenged. "She comes," he said. "Mr. Worf, she is your responsibility." Worf looked at Cameron with an expression that suggested he found this arrangement personally offensive. Cameron filed this information and moved on. The away team consisted of Picard, Worf, Data, and Cameron, transported down in 2 pairs to coordinates triangulated from the distress signal's origin point, a city of extraordinary architectural grace, all sweeping organic curves and pale stone that caught the afternoon light and held it like something precious. The city had been built by people who believed beauty was not a luxury, but a baseline requirement of civilization. Cameron noted this, cross-referenced it with nothing in her database, and kept walking. Theed. She would learn the name later. For now, it was simply a city under occupation. An occupation had a specific texture that Cameron had learned to recognize across multiple timelines. The particular silence of people who had learned that drawing attention was dangerous, the positioning of armed figures at intersections calculated not for defense but for visibility, the way civilians moved in the slightly too deliberate manner of people performing normalcy under observation. The occupying forces were droids. Cameron stopped walking for exactly 0.6 seconds when she saw the first one, a tall, thin biped of pale cream-colored metal with a flat, expressionless face and a blaster rifle held in both hands, with the mechanical certainty of something that had never experienced doubt. Then she saw 12 more of them at the next intersection. Then a line of them moving a group of civilians, humans, she registered, along with a variety of other species she had no classification for, toward a processing area 2 blocks north. "Robots," she said. "Battle droids," Data said at her shoulder. "Part of a force called the Trade Federation Droid Army. They are remotely controlled via a central command ship in orbit." He paused. "I find it noteworthy that your immediate response to encountering them was to stop, not to retreat." "I was assessing their capabilities," Cameron said. "They're slow. Their targeting systems have a 0.3-second acquisition delay. Their blasters fire a plasma bolt at approximately 800 meters per second." She looked at Data. "They're not a serious threat to me." "No," Data agreed. "Nor to me. However, the captain prefers we avoid unnecessary confrontation with forces we do not yet fully understand." Cameron looked at Picard, who was speaking quietly into his comm badge while keeping his back to a wall, in the way of someone who had conducted operations in hostile territory before and had the instincts to prove it. Worf had positioned himself at the corner with a hand on the phaser at his hip and the alert stillness of a predator who had identified 6 possible threats and ranked them in order of priority. She respected that. Competence in any form was worth respecting. The distress signal was originating from a building 200 meters ahead, a structure of governmental significance based on its size, its position at the city's center, and the density of droid patrols surrounding it. A palace. Cameron ran the architectural geometry and identified 11 possible entry points with varying degrees of exposure. Then she stopped again. Her audio sensors, calibrated to detect sound across a frequency range no human ear could access, picked up something from inside the palace walls that her threat assessment systems immediately elevated to Priority 1 status. 2 heartbeats, moving fast, combat elevated, human or near human, she could not be certain. The biomechanical signature of beings moving with trained, purposeful aggression, and one other signal, something she had no classification for whatsoever. A being whose vital signs registered and then didn't, flickering at the edge of her sensors like a flame in wind, present and absent simultaneously, generating a localized electromagnetic field that matched no biological profile in any database she carried. Not a droid, not a human, not anything she had encountered before. Cameron looked at Picard. "There is someone inside that palace," she said, "who is not what they appear to be. Their biosignature is partially masked, deliberately." She paused. "In my experience, Beings who mask their biosignatures in active conflict zones are not there to help the people being occupied. Picard met her eyes. Can you identify them? Not yet, Cameron said. I need to be closer. Worf stepped up beside her, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression held something other than suspicion. It held the particular focused attention of a warrior who had just heard something important. Then we move, he said. The Palace of Theed had been designed for ceremony, not defense. Cameron cataloged this assessment within 4 seconds of crossing the threshold through a service entrance that Worf had opened with an application of force that technically qualified as breaking and entering, but that Picard had chosen not to comment on. The interior corridors were tall and vaulted, lined with carved stone that depicted historical scenes Cameron could not contextualize, lit by fixtures that burned with something warmer and less efficient than electricity. Torchlight and elegance, and the distant sound of droids marching in patterns designed by someone who had never studied actual security deployment. She was already 3 steps ahead of the away team when she registered the heartbeats again. Closer now, 2 floors up, and moving laterally, northwest, at a pace suggesting controlled urgency rather than panic. Trained individuals, the larger of the 2 heartbeats carried the particular rhythmic steadiness of someone who had learned, through long practice, to keep their pulse calm in situations that would spike the heart rate of any ordinary person. A warrior's heartbeat. Cameron had calibrated herself to John Connor's heartbeat over years of proximity, and she knew the specific quality of a human being who had learned not to be afraid of fear. The third signal was stronger now, too, and stranger, that flickering electromagnetic presence that her sensors kept reaching for and failing to resolve. It had a location, 3rd floor, Eastern Corridor, but it seemed to exist slightly outside the parameters of her detection equipment, as though it occupied a frequency her instruments were not designed to measure. She stopped at a junction and held up one hand. The away team halted behind her with varying degrees of grace. Data immediately, Worf half a step later, Picard with the instinctive discipline of a man who had learned to read tactical signals from people he trusted, even when he wasn't certain he trusted them yet. The unidentified biosignature, Cameron said quietly. It's moved. It was in the Eastern Corridor 20 seconds ago. It's now in the Northern Corridor directly above us. She looked at the ceiling. It moved 40 meters in 20 seconds without triggering a single droid patrol response. Stealth capability, Worf said. Or the droids have been directed to ignore it, Data said. Cameron processed this possibility and elevated her threat assessment by 34%. A being that the occupying force's military units were programmed to avoid was either an extremely valuable asset to that occupying force or something so dangerous that the occupying force had made a calculated decision that engaging it cost more than it was worth. Neither option was reassuring. We need to find the people generating those 2 heartbeats, Cameron said. They're the distress signal source. And we need to do it before whatever is on the 3rd floor finds them first. Picard nodded once. The gesture had the quality of a man who had spent 40 years making decisions with incomplete information and had made peace with the necessity of it. Worf Data, Northern Stairwell. Cameron, you're with me. Worf looked like he wanted to object to this arrangement but said nothing. He and Data moved toward the Northern Stairwell with the coordinated efficiency of people who had worked together long enough to have developed a shared physical grammar. Cameron fell into step beside Picard, who kept pace with her without apparent effort, his eyes moving across the corridor with the alert, systematic attention of a trained explorer in unfamiliar terrain. You said the 3rd signal is partially masked, Picard said, his voice barely above a breath. Can you describe what you're detecting? An electromagnetic field that fluctuates between presence and absence, Cameron said. It doesn't correspond to any biological or mechanical system in my records. It's not a cloaking device. The field pattern is wrong for technology. It's more like, she paused, processing, like something that exists at the boundary of detectable reality, as though the being generating it has a relationship with physical space that differs from standard matter. Picard was quiet for 2 seconds. The Force, he said. Cameron looked at him. We've encountered it before, in records and in person, he said. An energy field generated by living things. Some individuals can interact with it consciously. It can create effects that appear to violate normal physics. He paused. If what you're detecting is a force-sensitive individual, the signal masking you're observing may be deliberate concealment of their presence. A technique. Cameron processed this. Is it always used for benign purposes? Picard's expression gave her the answer before he spoke. No. They found the stairwell and moved upward. Cameron ahead, and Picard 2 steps behind her, and she was already running projections on the third-floor layout based on the exterior architectural geometry when she heard it, a sound that her audio sensors captured at 340 meters per second, and her processing systems identified in 0.002 seconds. A lightsaber igniting. She had no record of lightsabers. She had no classification for the specific harmonic frequency of a plasma blade contained by a magnetic field and powered by a crystalline energy focus. But she knew the sound of a weapon being drawn. Across every form and caliber and technology she had encountered in 4 years of war, and this sound had the same quality as all of them, the particular, irreversible note of violence becoming imminent. She was running before the sound finished registering. Third floor, eastern corridor transitioning to the grand entrance hall. She burst through a set of ornamental doors that shattered inward and took in the scene in a single visual sweep that her processors expanded into comprehensive tactical data in 0.15 seconds. 2 men. One older, lean and still, with a quality of absolute presence that seemed to make the space around him more real. Long hair, simple robes, a lightsaber. Green, she registered. Green plasma blade. Held in a guard position that her combat analysis systems recognized as sophisticated even without a reference framework for the specific martial form. Calm. Frightened underneath the calm, but not letting the fear move to his hands. The younger one behind him, late teens or early 20s, darker complexion, a second lightsaber held with the particular tension of someone who was good and knew it and was currently confronted with something that was making him question whether good was going to be enough. And the third figure, facing them from the far end of the corridor, approximately 1.85 meters tall, athletic build beneath black robes that moved like liquid shadow, a face that Cameron's threat assessment systems flagged immediately, not for any specific feature, but for the quality of absolute focus it projected, the way it held no expression except the particular blank concentration of something that had decided to kill and was simply working out the most efficient method. Red lightsaber, double-bladed, both ends ignited, and the electromagnetic field, the flickering, boundary-defying signal she had been tracking, was coming from all 3 of them simultaneously, but from the black-robed figure, with an intensity and a darkness that made her sensors react in a way she had no category for, like interference. Like static on a frequency that should have been clear. The black-robed figure's yellow eyes moved from the 2 men to Cameron. Cameron ran a complete threat assessment in 0.4 seconds and arrived at a conclusion that she filed under the category her neural net had developed specifically for situations that exceeded normal parameters. Extremely dangerous. Engaged immediately. She crossed the 40 meters between herself and Darth Maul in 1.8 seconds. Maul moved to meet her. This was her first significant data point about him. He did not hesitate. Most combatants, upon seeing an unknown entity cross 40 meters of corridor in under 2 seconds, experienced a threat recalibration delay, a fraction of a second in which their tactical assessment systems, biological or otherwise, attempted to update their model of the engagement. Trained warriors minimized this delay. Exceptional ones reduced it to near zero. Maul had no delay at all. The double-bladed lightsaber came around in a horizontal arc at neck height, a killing stroke delivered with the mechanical precision of someone who had spent decades reducing violence to pure geometry. Cameron ducked under it by 4.3 centimeters. Not the dramatic, expressive dodge of someone reacting to danger, but the minimal, efficient movement of a system that had already calculated the blade's trajectory 0.2 seconds before it arrived, and drove her right elbow into Maul's midsection with 847 pounds of force. He moved with it, absorbed it, redirected the momentum through his body in a way that her impact sensors told her should not have been physically possible for a being of his mass and skeletal structure, spinning with the force of the blow rather than against it, and bringing the second blade of his saber around in a vertical cut, aimed at her spine. She was already moving, left, forward. Inside his guard, her combat processors had been running continuous analysis since she first detected his biosignature, and they had already identified several relevant facts. He was faster than a baseline human, stronger than his build suggested, and moved with a fluidity that indicated either extraordinary training, physiological enhancement, or both. He was also accustomed to opponents who feared him. The yellow eyes had registered her approach and found something in her movement pattern that gave him a fraction of a second of recalibration after all. Not hesitation, but adjustment. She had surprised him, not with her speed, with her silence. Most opponents, organic or otherwise, generated some form of fear response. It was detectable. Biological systems flooded with adrenaline, produced specific pheromone signatures, altered their movement patterns in characteristic ways. Cameron generated none of these signals, and Maul's combat algorithms, she was certain he had them, built and refined through years of training under someone who had systematically weaponized every aspect of his existence, had not accounted for an opponent whose body chemistry remained perfectly static under lethal threat. She caught his right wrist on the third exchange, her fingers closing around the joint with calibrated pressure, enough to disrupt his grip without snapping the bone, because she was still operating under Picard's implicit instruction that this was an assessment, not an execution, and used his own rotational momentum to redirect the saber blade into the corridor wall, where it carved a 2-meter gash in the stone before he wrenched free. He leaped backward, 4 meters, straight up and back, landing on the corridor's upper balcony railing, with the casual precision of something that had a completely different relationship with gravity than physics suggested it should. Cameron looked up at him. He looked down at her. In the sudden stillness, she heard Qui-Gon Jinn's voice behind her, low and careful. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't do anything that reads as aggression." "He just tried to kill me," Cameron said, without turning around. "Yes," Qui-Gon said, "and you're still alive, which means he's reassessing. That is the most valuable tactical position you can be in with a Sith." Cameron processed this. She filed the word Sith under new classification and kept her eyes on Maul, who was doing something she had not anticipated. He was still, not the stillness of someone preparing to attack. She knew that stillness. She had studied it across 1,000 combat scenarios, but the stillness of something genuinely calculating. His head tilted 7 degrees to the right. The yellow eyes moved across her with systematic thoroughness. He was running his own assessment. She let him. She stood in the corridor with her hands at her sides and her posture carrying no threat and no submission and nothing at all except the patient, absolute calm of a system that was not afraid and was not pretending not to be afraid and had no framework for pretending in the first place. It was her behavioral modeling suggested, deeply unsettling to most organic beings. It appeared to be unsettling to Maul. He spoke. His voice was a low, controlled instrument, shaped by training into something that carried authority as a default setting. She did not understand the language. It was not any language in her database, but the universal translator function that Data had quietly activated on a communicator he'd slipped into her jacket pocket during the walk upstairs, rendered it into English with a half-second delay. "What are you?" "A machine," Cameron said. "Built to protect humans. There are no humans worth protecting." "I disagree," Cameron said. Something moved in the yellow eyes. Not anger, closer to interest, which she found more concerning than anger would have been. Behind her, she heard Obi-Wan exhale, a controlled breath, the specific exhalation of a trained person, recalibrating after a crisis peak. Qui-Gon had moved to stand beside her, not in front of her, which she noted as a meaningful choice. He was not positioning himself as her protector. He was positioning himself as her ally, which required him to make a rapid determination about her that most beings would have taken significantly longer to reach. "He won't attack again immediately," Qui-Gon said quietly. "Not until he understands what you are. Sith collect information before they engage threats they cannot categorize. How long does that give us?" "Minutes, perhaps less." A pause. "You hit him." "Yes, with your bare hands." "At that speed." Another pause, different in quality. He didn't expect that. No one does, Cameron said. It's useful. Above them, Maul had not moved, but his free hand had risen to hover near his comlink, and Cameron's audio sensors caught the specific electromagnetic precursor of a transmission being prepared. He was calling someone, or calling for something. She ran a rapid probability assessment. Maul had come here with a specific objective, the elimination of the two Jedi behind her. She had inferred this from his positioning and his target priority during the initial engagement. She had disrupted that objective. He was now requesting either backup or instruction, which meant there was someone above him in a command structure who would need to be informed that the operation had encountered an unanticipated variable. Cameron looked at Qui-Gon. "We need to move," she said. "He's reporting my presence to someone. Whoever sent him will want to know what I am, and unlike him, they may decide that the answer to that question is less important than eliminating the uncertainty." Qui-Gon looked at her with eyes that held a quality she had no precise classification for, a deep, patient attention that seemed to look not at her face but through it, searching for something underneath the surface. "You're not afraid of him," he said. It was not a question. "No," Cameron said. "Why not?" She considered the precise formulation of the answer for 0.3 seconds. "Because I've already calculated 17 ways to stop him," she said. "Fear is useful when it motivates preparation." "I'm already prepared." Qui-Gon was quiet for 1 second. Then, with the unhurried movement of a man who had learned that urgency and haste were not the same thing, he gestured toward the far corridor. "Then let's not waste your preparation," he said. "This way." They moved through the palace in a configuration that Cameron's tactical systems approved of. Qui-Gon leading, Obi-Wan covering the rear, Cameron in the middle where her sensor range provided maximum early warning coverage for threats approaching from any vector. Picard had rejoined them from the northern stairwell with Data and Worf, and the group had become something that defied easy categorization. 2 Jedi, 4 Starfleet officers, and a Terminator moving through an occupied palace with the particular focused silence of people who had individually survived enough dangerous situations to know that conversation was a luxury reserved for safety. Cameron ran continuous scans. Maul's biosignature had descended from the balcony and was moving parallel to them on the floor above, not pursuing, not retreating, maintaining distance with the patient precision of something that had decided observation was currently more valuable than engagement. She tracked him with 12% of her processing capacity and allocated the remainder to mapping their route, cataloging droid patrol patterns, and running background analysis on the 2 Jedi whose presence generated that persistent electromagnetic interference her sensors kept failing to fully resolve. The Force. Picard had named it. She cross-referenced everything he had told her with what her sensors were currently detecting and built a working model. An energy field, pervasive and non-local, interacting with biological systems in ways that produced measurable physical effects. Telekinesis, precognition, enhanced physical capability. The model was incomplete. She was certain it was incomplete, but it gave her a framework for interpreting what she was observing. Qui-Gon Jinn moved through the Force the way a skilled swimmer moved through water. Cameron could detect it now that she knew what to look for, a subtle, continuous interaction between his biology and the ambient field, like a conversation happening below the threshold of speech. His heartbeat was slower than it should have been for someone navigating an active combat zone. His reaction time, on the 2 occasions that droid patrols had rounded corners ahead of them and he had redirected the group before Cameron's own sensors had finished processing the threat, was faster than his neurological architecture should have allowed. He was receiving information she could not access, from a source she could not directly detect, and acting on it with a confidence that was not arrogance, but something quieter and more absolute, the confidence of someone who had learned to trust a signal that had never been wrong. Obi-Wan was different, younger, more reactive, his interaction with the Force carrying the quality of someone who had learned the theory thoroughly and was still in the process of learning to stop thinking about the theory and simply act. He was excellent. Cameron's combat assessment placed him well above any baseline human fighter she had encountered. But where Qui-Gon's movements had the seamless quality of complete integration, Obi-Wan's had the slightly effortful quality of mastery that had not yet become instinct. He was watching her, She registered his attention as a constant low-level signal, not hostile, not fearful, but the specific quality of observation directed at something that needed to be understood before it could be trusted. She found this reasonable. They reached a secure chamber on the palace's second floor. A communication room, she assessed, based on the equipment lining the walls, much of it damaged by what appeared to be deliberately placed charges rather than combat. The Trade Federation had disabled the planet's external communications. She filed this as confirmation that whoever was orchestrating the occupation was more strategically sophisticated than the droid army's blunt deployment suggested. Picard moved to the communication equipment and began a quiet, efficient assessment of what remained functional. Data assisted him with the particular fluid competence of someone for whom understanding unfamiliar technology was not a skill, but a reflex. Worf positioned himself at the door, with his phaser drawn and his attention fixed on the corridor, with an intensity that Cameron respected, even as she noted it was slightly misallocated. The primary threat was above them, not outside the door. Qui-Gon stood in the center of the room and looked at Cameron with that quality of deep, patient attention she had noted before. "I'd like to understand what you are," he said. Not as a threat assessment, as a genuine question. Cameron considered how to answer this. She had answered versions of it before, to Sarah Connor, to John, to Derek Reese, who had never accepted any answer she gave as sufficient. The question always carried weight, beyond its literal content. What are you was never purely taxonomic. It was always also asking, are you safe? Are you trustworthy? Are you something I can predict? "I'm a cybernetic organism," she said, "living tissue over a metal endoskeleton, built by machines in a future where machines and humans are at war. I was reprogrammed to protect humans instead of terminate them." She paused. "I don't know if that answers your question." "It answers part of it," Qui-Gon said. "The mechanical part." He studied her face with eyes that seemed to look for something specific. "The Force is present in all living things. In you, it's—" He paused, quiet. Not absent. Quiet, like a signal from very far away. Cameron processed this. "I have living tissue components." "Yes, but it's not the tissue I'm sensing." He seemed genuinely puzzled, which she found notable. He was not a man who appeared puzzled easily. "There's something in your neural architecture, a quality of choice that reads, to the Force, almost like consciousness." "Almost," Obi-Wan said from across the room, and his tone carried an edge that was not quite hostility, but was adjacent to it. Cameron looked at him. "You don't think I'm conscious?" "I think consciousness is more than processing speed and decision trees," Obi-Wan said. He was not being cruel. His tone carried the specific quality of genuine philosophical conviction, not dismissal. "The Force connects living beings. It flows through them. It doesn't flow through machines. And yet your master said he can sense something in me." He said almost. "Almost is more than nothing," Cameron said. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Qui-Gon made a sound that Cameron's behavioral analysis systems identified, after a brief processing delay, as the beginning of a laugh that he had chosen at the last moment to keep small. "She's not wrong, Obi-Wan," he said. Obi-Wan pressed his lips together in the expression of a young man who has been gently corrected by someone he respects and is being gracious about not enjoying it. Worf spoke from the doorway without turning around. "The philosophical debate is interesting. The Sith warrior who has been stationary on the floor above us for the last 4 minutes is more immediately interesting." Cameron had been tracking Maul's position continuously. Worf was correct. He had stopped moving. Had established a fixed position directly above the communication room. Was either listening or waiting. Both possibilities were bad. "He's not alone anymore," Cameron said, running a rapid rescan of the building's upper floors. 2 additional biosignatures have joined him. Different physiological profile. Denser. Mechanical augmentation. Bladed weapons. She looked at Qui-Gon. "Are there other beings like him?" "Serving the same organization." Something moved through Qui-Gon's expression. Not fear, but the specific quality of a man receiving confirmation of something he had suspected and had hoped he was wrong about. "Not that we know of," he said carefully. "The Sith are believed to operate in pairs. A master and an apprentice." "Then these aren't Sith," Cameron said. "There's something else." Sent by whoever controls the droids. She ran probability matrices. They're positioned to cut off our exit routes. We have approximately 8 minutes before they complete the encirclement. She looked at Picard. Can you reach the Enterprise? Picard looked at Data, who had been quietly and systematically reassembling components from 3 separate communication units into something that did not match any original design, but had the focused intentionality of improvised genius. 4 minutes, Data said, without looking up. We have 8, Cameron said. You have 4. She turned back to the door. Worf stepped aside for her without being asked, which she noted as a meaningful shift in his assessment of her. I'll make sure we keep them, she said. The first of the 2 new combatants came through the ceiling. Cameron had tracked the biosignature moving across the floor above and calculated the intercept point 3.1 seconds before the impact. Enough time to step aside, pull Worf back from the doorway by his collar with one hand, and position herself between the entry point and the rest of the room. The figure that dropped through the carved stone ceiling in a cascade of pale dust and ornamental debris was humanoid, heavily built, wearing armor that her materials analysis identified as a Durasteel composite she had no prior record of. Twin vibroblade weapons, one in each hand, already active. She could hear the high-frequency oscillation at 47,000 hertz, above human hearing range but well within hers. He was fast. She was faster. She took the first blade on her left forearm, where the endoskeleton absorbed the impact with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil, and drove her right palm into his chin with enough force to lift him 3 centimeters off the floor. He recovered midair. Good, she noted. Very good. And landed in a combat crouch, reassessing her with eyes that held the particular flat calculation of a professional killer who had just encountered an unexpected problem. The second combatant came through the doorway simultaneously. Cameron had allocated 23% of her combat processing to this threat vector. She caught the vibroblade on the back of her hand, felt the mimetic polyalloy surface of her human disguise part along the cut to reveal the silver gleam of endoskeleton beneath, and drove her elbow back into the second attacker's sternum with 900 pounds of force. He went down. He got up. She revised her force estimate upward. Electrostaff would be more effective, Data said from behind her, where he was still working on the communication array, with the serene focus of someone who had decided that Cameron was handling the immediate problem adequately and that his contribution was therefore best directed elsewhere. I don't have one, Cameron said, and caught the first attacker's wrist on his next strike, rotated it past its structural tolerance, and listened to the specific sound that indicated she had found that tolerance's limit. He dropped the vibroblade. She kicked it across the room toward Worf, who picked it up with the expression of a man who had just been given a birthday present he had not expected. The engagement lasted 47 seconds. At the end of it, both armored figures were restrained. Cameron had improvised bindings from sections of cable she had stripped from the damaged communication equipment with one hand, while continuing to manage the combat with the other. And the room was significantly messier than it had been, and Obi-Wan was looking at her, with an expression that had moved considerably from its earlier position of philosophical skepticism. You pulled the cable out of the wall during the fight, he said. I multitask, Cameron said. Qui-Gon was crouching beside one of the restrained figures, examining him with that quality of deep attention. Bounty hunters, he said, hired by the Trade Federation, not force-sensitive. He looked up at Cameron. You knew that before you engaged them. Their movement patterns didn't show force interaction, she said. They were fast, but mechanically fast. Trained speed, not enhanced speed. You can tell the difference. I'm learning to. She looked at the ceiling hole. Dust was still settling through the afternoon light that came through the breach. Above it, Maul's biosignature had not moved. He was still in position, still watching, still calculating. He sent them first, she said, to assess me, to gather data before he commits to a second engagement. That is not standard Sith behavior, Qui-Gon said, standing. They prefer direct confrontation. It's what I would do, Cameron said, if I encountered something I couldn't immediately categorize. Qui-Gon looked at her steadily. You understand him. I understand tactical thinking, Cameron said. The specifics differ. The logic is the same. From across the room, Picard spoke. Data. 30 seconds, Data said. Cameron moved to the room's single window and looked out over Theed. The city lay in the amber of late afternoon, its beautiful architecture unchanged by occupation in any physical sense. The droids had not damaged what they controlled, which was its own form of insult, she thought. The reduction of a civilization to a logistics problem. On the plaza below, a group of civilians was being moved in formation, and she tracked their faces with her optical sensors and ran the specific analysis she had run 10,000 times in her own timeline. Threat assessment of the people doing the moving, vulnerability assessment of the people being moved, calculation of intervention cost versus protection benefit. The calculus was familiar, the galaxy was not. Picard appeared at her shoulder, and they stood for a moment looking at the occupied city together, and Cameron found herself running an analysis she had not expected to run, a comparative assessment of Jean-Luc Picard. She had met commanders before. Sarah Connor was one. John Connor was one. She had run evaluations of both, continuously, because understanding your principal was fundamental to protecting them. Picard was something different. He carried authority the way Qui-Gon carried the Force, not as a performance but as a baseline condition, something so thoroughly integrated into his architecture that it no longer required any effort to maintain. He was looking at the civilians below with an expression Cameron had learned to identify across multiple humans. The expression of someone who understands exactly what is wrong and is calculating, with controlled fury, what can be done about it. "The Queen," he said. "The distress signal originated from her. Is she still in the palace?" "Biosignature consistent with the signal source is currently in the throne room," Cameron said. "Ground floor, northeast section. 7 droid guards, 2 organic advisors, 1 additional humanoid I cannot fully resolve. The Force interference is significant in that location." Picard turned. "Another Sith?" "No. Different. The field is lighter. Like Qui-Gon's, but younger." She paused. "There's a child with her. Force-sensitive." Something shifted in Qui-Gon's posture across the room. A very slight movement, but Cameron's sensors caught it. A subtle realignment of attention. The physical expression of a mind that had just received information it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. "A child," he said. "Approximately 9 years old." Cameron said. "Anomalous biosignature. The force field around him is..." She searched her new, incomplete model for adequate language. "Dense. Concentrated. Like a signal with very high amplitude." Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan exchanged a look. Cameron read it the way she read all human nonverbal communication. Systematically, comprehensively, and the information it contained elevated approximately 6 parallel probability threads simultaneously. The look carried recognition, significance, caution, and a specific quality she had learned to associate with humans who had encountered something that exceeded their current framework and were deciding how much to reveal about that to people they had not yet fully decided to trust. "Got it," Data said. The communication array flickered to life with a sound like the clearing of a throat, and the view screen assembled from salvaged components rendered a static-edged image of the Enterprise-E's bridge, where Lieutenant Commander LaForge was leaning forward in the command chair, with the expression of someone who had been managing a difficult situation calmly, and was very glad to see a familiar face. "Captain," he said, "we have a situation up here." "As do we," Picard said. "Report." "The blockade vessels have increased their orbital coverage in the last 20 minutes. They know we're here, sir. They've been polite about it so far. But we've also detected an encrypted transmission from the surface to the command ship approximately 12 minutes ago." Geordi paused. "Someone down there told them about you." Cameron did not look away from the window. Above her, on the floor she could no longer directly access, Maul's biosignature had finally moved. He was descending. "We need to leave this room," she said. "Now." They moved as a unit through the palace's lower corridors with the particular compressed urgency of people who had run out of time for deliberation and were now operating entirely on assessment and instinct. Cameron led, her sensors sweeping continuously. Maul's biosignature tracked as a priority 1 thread, while she simultaneously mapped droid patrol patterns, monitored the Queen's position in the throne room, and maintained a secondary watch on the child, whose force signature pulsed through the palace's stone floors, like a heartbeat she could feel but not explain. Picard was on his comm badge with Geordi. keeping his voice low and his sentences short, with the efficiency of someone conducting command functions under fire. Worf had the confiscated vibroblade in one hand and his phaser in the other, and moved with the focused intensity of a Klingon warrior who had decided that this situation, whatever its other complications, had provided him with something he could directly engage with, which was an improvement on the last several hours of strategic ambiguity. Data moved silently, processing everything, contributing precise navigational corrections whenever Cameron's route planning required adjustment based on droid patrol data he had extracted from the palace's own security network during the 4 minutes he had spent rebuilding the communication array. Obi-Wan was at her left shoulder. He had been there since they left the communication room, maintaining a position that was close enough to be supportive and far enough to be operational, and Cameron had noticed that his hand rested near his lightsaber with the relaxed readiness of someone who had stopped thinking about whether he trusted her and started thinking about what they were going to do together. She found this satisfying in a way she filed under the category her neural net had developed for states that resembled what humans described as reassurance. "He's following us," she said quietly, 40 meters back, moving at the same pace we are, not gaining. "He's hurting us," Qui-Gon said, from just ahead. "Not a question. Probability 78%, Cameron said. "He wants us in a specific location. The geometry of his movement suggests he's been in this palace before. He knows the layout better than we do." She ran the building's architectural map and cross-referenced Maul's trajectory. "He's steering us toward the central hangar." "The Naboo Royal Starship is in the central hangar," Obi-Wan said. "That was the Queen's planned escape route. He's known about it." "Then that's where we're going," Cameron said. Qui-Gon glanced back at her. "He wants us there." "Yes," Cameron said. "And I want to be there. Our objectives align for different reasons." "That's useful." "You want to fight him again," Obi-Wan said. His tone was not accusatory. It was the tone of someone making an accurate observation and waiting to see if the subject would confirm it. "I want to finish the assessment I started," Cameron said. "The first engagement gave me baseline data. I need more to determine the optimal method of neutralizing him permanently." The corridor opened ahead of them into a wider passage, and Cameron heard it before she saw it. The specific acoustic signature of a large interior space, the echoing quality of high ceilings and hard surfaces, and beneath it, the low hum of a starship's systems in standby mode. They came through the passage into the hangar, and she cataloged it in a single sweep, vast, vaulted, lit by overhead fixtures that cast clean light across a sleek silver vessel of extraordinary design. Organic curves, no hard angles, built by people who believed that beauty and function were not competing values, but expressions of the same underlying principle. The Queen was already there. Cameron had tracked her biosignature moving from the throne room during the last 3 minutes of their transit, and had said nothing, because the movement had been consistent with a deliberate evacuation rather than a hostile event, and because Picard had enough active variables to manage without adding speculative ones. Queen Amidala of Naboo stood at the base of her ship's boarding ramp with 7 handmaidens in identical robes and a security escort of 6 humans in orange flight suits, and she was looking at the group that had just entered her hangar with the composed, evaluating expression of someone who had been trained from a very young age to project absolute authority in situations she did not fully control. She was young. Cameron's age estimation systems placed her between 14 and 16 years old. This did not alter Cameron's assessment of the authority the Queen projected, because Cameron had learned, across 4 years of working with John Connor, that the correlation between age and capability was weak and unreliable. Beside the Queen, half a step behind her, and slightly to her left, stood a small boy in rough clothing, 9 years old, olive skin, an expression that combined wide-eyed wonder at the assembled strangers with a fundamental fearlessness that was either training, constitution, or something else entirely. The force field around him was extraordinary. Even Cameron's incomplete model was sufficient to tell her that. It was like standing near a generator of enormous output, a constant, powerful emanation that her sensors registered as pressure without being able to assign it a direction. Qui-Gon crossed the hangar floor toward the boy with the measured pace of someone who is trying very hard not to move too fast and is only partially succeeding. "You're safe," he said, and the words were addressed nominally to the Queen, but his eyes were on the child. "We need to leave," the Queen said. Her voice was precisely controlled. "The Trade Federation will—" "He's here," Cameron said. The hangar doors at the far end had opened. Not dramatically, no explosion, no burst of light, simply opened, the mechanism responding to a command given by someone who had obtained the override codes, and Darth Maul walked through them into the hangar with the unhurried pace of someone who had arrived exactly where he intended to be, at exactly the time he had planned. His lightsaber was not yet ignited. He walked with both hands loose at his sides, his yellow eyes moving across the assembled group with systematic thoroughness. The Queen, her handmaidens, the pilots, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, the Starfleet officers, and finally settling on Cameron with the quality of attention that she had identified, in their first encounter, as genuine interest rather than tactical assessment. He had thought about her. During the interval between their first engagement and this moment, he had processed what she was and arrived at conclusions she could not directly access, but could infer from the quality of his attention. He was not afraid of her, but he was, and she found this significant, not certain he could defeat her, which was a different thing entirely, and a thing that his bearing suggested he was unaccustomed to experiencing. Picard stepped forward. Cameron moved to step with him, and he raised one hand slightly, not a command, a request, and she held her position. She understood. He was attempting the diplomatic option first. She gave him probability, 11% of success, and allocated the remaining processing capacity to combat preparation. "My name is Captain Jean-Luc Picard," he said, and his voice carried across the hangar with the quality of a man who had spoken to species, entities, and powers that dwarfed anything in this room and had never once allowed his voice to suggest that this was remarkable. "We have no quarrel with you. We came to this planet in response to a distress call. Whatever conflict exists here between your organization and the people of Naboo, we are not party to it. Stand down, and we can discuss." Maul ignited his lightsaber. Both blades. The red light filled the hangar like the opening of a wound, and the sound of it, that particular harmonic frequency she had catalogued in the palace corridor, echoed off the high ceiling and came back changed, multiplied, filling the space with resonance. He looked at Picard for 1 second. Then he looked at Cameron. "The machine," he said, through the universal translator's half-second delay, "does not frighten me." "I know," Cameron said. She was already moving. "But you should have spent that second on something more useful than saying so." She hit him at full speed with her right shoulder, driving 640 pounds of endoskeletal mass into his chest before the second syllable of his sentence had finished echoing off the hangar ceiling. Maul had been expecting it. She registered this in the first 0.1 seconds of contact. His stance had already begun shifting into a receiving position, weight redistributing, the double-bladed saber sweeping inward to create a barrier rather than attempting an offensive strike. He had learned from their first engagement. She had expected him to learn. She had learned too. She went low under the saber sweep, took the blade across her upper back, where it carved through the mimetic polyalloy surface, and scored the endoskeleton beneath, with a shriek of metal on plasma, and came up inside his guard, with a strike to his solar plexus, that she had calculated would be ineffective against his conditioning, and deployed anyway, because its real purpose was positional, driving him back 2 steps, creating separation, giving herself room to read his next movement before it arrived. He gave her exactly the response her models predicted, a force-assisted leap that carried him 12 meters straight up to the hangar's overhead gantry, landing with perfect balance on a structural beam no wider than his foot, the red blades casting shifting shadows across the silver hull of the Naboo ship below. She was already climbing. Not leaping. She had observed that force-assisted movement allowed him to change direction mid-trajectory in ways that her own purely mechanical movement could not match, and matching him in the air was therefore a disadvantageous engagement geometry. She went up the side of the Naboo ship instead, fingers and feet finding purchase in the minimal gaps between hull plates, ascending at a rate her combat systems calculated would bring her to gantry level in 4.2 seconds. Behind her and below, she heard the engagement she had predicted, Qui-Gon's green lightsaber igniting, Obi-Wan's blue a half-second later, and the specific acoustic signature of 2 trained Force users engaging a third in a 3-dimensional combat space. She allocated 8% of her processing to monitoring that engagement, not to intervene, not yet, but to track the variables, because Maul fighting two Jedi simultaneously while also managing her was a different tactical problem than any of his constituent elements, and she needed to understand how he distributed his attention. The answer arrived in 1.3 seconds. He didn't. He fought all three threats simultaneously, without apparent prioritization, the double-bladed saber moving in continuous sweeping arcs that addressed each attack vector as it arose, with the automatic, precognitive speed of something that had trained beyond the point where conscious decision-making was a meaningful part of combat. He was operating on a level below thought, pure pattern, pure response, pure violence refined to its essential geometry. She reached the gantry as he disengaged from Obi-Wan's third strike and pivoted to meet her, and they came together on the narrow beam 40 meters above the hangar floor in a collision that sent vibrations through the entire gantry structure. He was better than she had initially assessed. The first engagement had provided baseline data. This engagement was providing refinement. He was faster than a baseline human by a factor of approximately 2.3, stronger by a factor of 1.8, with reflexes that operated at a speed suggesting neurological enhancement or the Force's direct intervention in his response architecture. His fighting style was aggressive and precise and built on an assumption of physical superiority over any opponent, an assumption that had, she calculated, been correct in every engagement he had conducted before today. She was not physically superior to him in every dimension. She was faster in linear movement, stronger in static force application, and completely immune to pain and fatigue. He was more agile in three-dimensional space, significantly more capable of unpredictable movement through force assistance, and possessed of a combat intelligence that adapted with a speed that her systems found genuinely impressive. They were, across the full assessment matrix, approximately matched. She found this information clarifying. He knew it too. She could see it in the quality of his attention. That specific recalibration she had observed in their first encounter, now refined by additional data into something that had moved past surprise and into something that was almost, by the behavioral modeling standards her neural net had developed, respect. Not for her as an entity, for her as a problem. The Sith, Qui-Gon had told her, collected information. Maul had been collecting information about her since the moment she had crossed 40 meters of corridor in 1.8 seconds. He had sent the bounty hunters. He had herded them to the hangar. He had positioned himself to continue the assessment. She realized, on the 14th exchange on the gantry beam, with the red light of his sabers leaving after images across her optical sensors, that he had not yet used the Force against her directly. He had used it for movement, for positioning, for speed. But he had not attempted a telekinetic throw, had not tried to crush or deflect her with the invisible force that she had observed him generate against the Jedi. He was testing whether she was susceptible to it before committing the energy to the attempt. She decided to let him find out. She dropped her left shoulder and gave him an opening. Small, precise, the kind of gap that a less sophisticated opponent would miss, and that a fighter of Maul's caliber would identify and exploit without conscious deliberation. He exploited it. A burst of force energy, invisible and immediate, hit her square in the chest. She moved with it. 17 meters of horizontal trajectory, entirely involuntary, until she caught a structural support with one hand and arrested her movement with a sound like a cable under extreme tension. She assessed the impact, 1,100 pounds of instantaneous force, consistent with what she had observed him generate against Qui-Gon in their earlier engagement. She had not gone through the hangar wall. Maul stood on the gantry beam and looked at the hand wrapped around the structural support and the stillness of the figure that had absorbed a force push that would have killed an unprotected human. The yellow eyes were very still. Below them, the engagement on the hangar floor had shifted. Picard had moved the Queen and her party to the ship's boarding ramp. Worf and Data were holding a position between the boarding ramp and the hangar entrance through which droid reinforcements had begun arriving. Worf with the vibroblade and a ferocity that the droid's targeting systems appeared to be inadequately prepared for, Data with a systematic, unhurried efficiency that was disassembling the droid units with a precision that bore, Cameron noted, a structural resemblance to her own combat style. The boy, Anakin, She had caught the name from Qui-Gon's voice during the evacuation, was on the ramp behind the Queen, and his force signature was spiking with an urgency that her sensors had no framework to interpret, but that felt, through her incomplete model, like a bell being struck. Obi-Wan was on the hangar floor, separated from Qui-Gon by a series of blast doors that had cycled shut in the chaos. She had tracked the sequence and registered it as deliberate, a manipulation of the facility's systems that had not come from the droids. Maul had triggered it remotely, dividing them. Qui-Gon was alone on the far side of the blast doors. Maul looked at Cameron on the gantry support. She looked back at him. The calculation was immediate and shared. He needed to get to Qui-Gon. She needed to prevent him from getting to Qui-Gon. Everything else was secondary. He moved. She moved. They met in the middle of the gantry, and the impact this time carried everything. No assessment, no restraint, no data collection. Just the full commitment of two systems that had completed their evaluation of each other and were now operating on conclusion rather than question. The gantry shuddered. Metal screamed against its own bolts. The red light swept in continuous arcs, and Cameron moved through it with the absolute focused efficiency of a machine that had been built for exactly this. Not this specific fight, not this specific galaxy, not this specific opponent with his force-enhanced speed and his ancient training and his yellow eyes that burned with something she still had no classification for, but for the fundamental, irreducible purpose of standing between a lethal threat and the humans it was trying to reach. Below her, she heard the blast doors begin to cycle open. She had 40 seconds. 40 seconds. She ran the calculation continuously, updating it every 0.3 seconds as new variables arrived, the blast doors cycling at a mechanical rate she had clocked during their earlier transit through the palace. The distance between Maul's current position and the door through which Qui-Gon waited, the time required for Maul to disengage from her and cross the hangar floor at force-assisted speed. The numbers were not favorable. If Maul broke from this engagement cleanly, he would reach Qui-Gon with approximately 9 seconds to spare before Obi-Wan could cycle through from the other side. 9 seconds was enough. She had seen what he could do in less, so she did not give him a clean break. She drove the engagement forward, not defensively, not in the measured assessment pattern she had used for the previous exchanges, but with the full offensive commitment of a system that had decided that controlling the geometry of the fight was more important than minimizing its own damage. She pushed him back along the gantry toward the hangar wall, not because the wall was tactically valuable, but because every meter he moved away from the blast doors was a meter he would have to recover when he tried to disengage. And recovery cost time, and time was the only resource she was actually managing. He recognized what she was doing. She saw it in the quality of his response, the way his defensive pattern shifted to create disengagement opportunities rather than counter-offensive ones. The specific footwork of a fighter who is trying to extract from a close engagement without giving his opponent a free strike at his back. He was good at it. She was better at preventing it. 31 seconds. He made his first genuine disengagement attempt on the 14th exchange, a force-assisted backward leap designed to create enough separation that she could not maintain contact before he redirected toward the floor. She had calculated this attempt as 73% probable on his next move and had already begun the counter before his feet left the gantry. She caught his trailing wrist with 2 fingers, and her grip, even at 2-finger contact, was 340 pounds of clamping force. He did not go where he intended to go. He went where their combined momentum carried them, which was into the gantry railing, and the railing gave way with a sound of tortured metal, and they fell together. 30 meters. Cameron's impact calculation updated mid-fall. The Naboo ship's hull would provide a better landing surface than the hangar floor. Harder for her, potentially damaging for the hull, but the geometry of their fall carried them across the ship's upper surface rather than the floor, and she made the decision in 0.2 seconds to use the hull as a braking surface rather than attempt a free-fall correction. They hit the hull together, Cameron taking the impact on her back and using her own body as an ablative surface between Maul and the ship's systems underneath. She was expendable in ways the ship was not, at least for the next 35 minutes, until Picard could get everyone aboard and clear the atmosphere. She felt the impact as pressure data, comprehensive and immediate. Her ablative plating along her back and shoulders had reached structural failure across approximately 34% of its surface area. Her left arm's primary actuator had sustained damage that reduced its grip strength to 67% of baseline. Her optical sensors flickered briefly as the power cell absorbed the impact shock, recovered in zero point 0.4 seconds. Maul had taken the impact on his side, protected partially by her body and partially by whatever the Force did for its users in moments of physical extremity. He was on his feet in zero point 0.9 seconds. She was on her feet in 0.7. 22 seconds. He looked at her across 2 meters of the Naboo ship's hull. The yellow eyes were different now. Still calculating, still cold. But underneath those qualities, something she had observed in very few opponents across 4 years of war. The specific quality of a combatant who has encountered a problem they cannot solve within their current operational parameters and is deciding whether to escalate or withdraw. He escalated. The Force hit her not as a push this time, but as something more concentrated. A sustained pressure, focused, wrapping around her chassis with an intentionality that suggested he was attempting not to throw her but to hold her, to pin her systems against each other and force a mechanical failure through sustained compressive force. She felt it as resistance in every joint, as a pressure against her endoskeleton that her structural integrity systems immediately flagged as requiring active countermeasure. She planted her feet against the hull and pushed back. Not with the Force. She had none to push with, or none she could consciously access, or none that was mature enough to be weaponized. She pushed back with the fundamental architecture of what she was. A machine built to specific tolerances, with specific load-bearing specifications, designed by engineers in a terrible future who had understood that the things they were building would face forces that should by rights destroy them, and had built them not to be destroyed. Her structural integrity held at 94.7%. Maul's expression changed. It was the smallest change, a micro-movement of musculature around the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his jaw. But Cameron's facial recognition systems caught it and classified it with a certainty that surprised her. This was the first time in this engagement, possibly in a very long time, that Darth Maul had experienced the specific sensation of trying his hardest and finding it insufficient. 12 seconds. She broke through the Force pressure with a forward step that cost her left knee actuator a stress fracture she would have to address later and closed the 2 meters between them in a single movement, driving her right forearm into his throat with controlled force. Enough to disrupt, not enough to kill. Because she had made a calculation about that too, somewhere in the last 8 seconds, a calculation that was partly tactical and partly something else, something her neural net processed under a category it had developed from 4 years of watching humans make choices and had labeled, with characteristic imprecision, as mercy. He went back. Off the hull, a controlled fall that became a force-assisted glide that brought him to the hangar floor 9 meters below, landing in a crouch, one hand touching down for balance. 7 seconds. Cameron looked at the blast doors. She looked at the distance between Maul and Qui-Gon's position. She jumped. Not a force-assisted leap. She had no force to assist her. She jumped the way a machine jumps, calculating trajectory, deploying every newton of force her leg actuators could generate, accepting that the arc would be imperfect and the landing would be hard, and none of that mattered as long as the geometry was correct. She covered 26 meters of horizontal distance and landed between Maul and the blast doors with a floor impact that cracked the hangar stone in a 2-meter radius and sent a shock through her entire chassis that her damaged systems would be processing for the next 40 minutes. She stood up. 3 seconds. Maul stood 8 meters away with his lightsaber raised and his eyes fixed on her, and behind her she heard the blast doors complete their cycle, the specific hydraulic release of a sealed door opening, and Qui-Gon Jinn's footsteps, measured and unhurried, crossing the threshold. 2 Jedi, 1 Terminator, and 8 meters of hangar floor between them and the thing that had come here to kill. Maul looked at the 3 of them. His yellow eyes moved across the assembled opposition, with the systematic thoroughness she had observed from the beginning, and she watched him run his own calculation, not with processing cores and probability matrices, but with whatever the Sith equivalent was, whatever dark and disciplined intelligence his training had refined over decades of preparation for a war he had been built to fight. 1 second. The reactor coupling behind him detonated, not a malfunction. Cameron's sensors caught the activation signal 0.002 seconds before the explosion and classified it immediately as deliberate, a shaped charge placed during his transit through the hangar, triggered remotely, designed not to destroy the hangar, but to destroy what was in a specific section of it. The blast radius was precisely calculated. She ran the numbers in zero point 0.1 seconds and arrived at an answer that her damage projection systems presented with the flat, unambiguous clarity of pure mathematics. Qui-Gon Jinn, at his current position, would sustain fatal injuries. Cameron moved, not toward Maul, not toward the exit, toward Qui-Gon, covering the 4 meters between them in 0.6 seconds, wrapping her compromised frame around his with the full structural commitment of an endoskeleton designed to absorb forces that would destroy organic tissue. Her back to the explosion, her systems already calculating the incoming damage and filing it under acceptable parameters. Because acceptable parameters for a Jedi Master were two entirely different equations, and she had run both. The blast hit her across her entire posterior surface. She felt it as data, comprehensive, immediate, catastrophic in specific subsystems, and manageable in the aggregate. Ablative plating along her back at 89% structural failure. Left arm actuator, now non-functional. 3 cracked vertebral support struts in her spinal column. Power cell integrity dropped to 61%. Her optical sensors flickered and held. Her legs held. Her grip on Qui-Gon held. She straightened slowly, turned around. Maul was gone. The hangar entrance through which he had arrived stood open, and beyond it the theed afternoon light fell across empty stone, and there was no biosignature within her sensor range that matched his specific electromagnetic profile. He had triggered the charge and moved simultaneously, using the explosion as cover for withdrawal, which told her that he had arrived at a conclusion about this engagement that she found, through her incomplete and imprecise model of what honor meant to beings who had been built around it, quietly significant. He had decided not to die today. Behind her, Qui-Gon's hand was on her shoulder. Not for support, she assessed, because his legs were steady and his breathing was controlled. For something else. Something her behavioral modeling processed as acknowledgement. "You held," he said. Cameron ran a systems diagnostic. 61% power, 43% ablative integrity. Left arm offline. 17 separate damage flags across her chassis, requiring attention within the next 6 hours to prevent cascade failure. "Yes," she said. Across the hangar, Obi-Wan was already at the boarding ramp, ushering the Queen's party aboard with the focused urgency of someone who understood that Maul's withdrawal was a pause, not a conclusion. Data and Worf fell back from the droid engagement at the hangar entrance. The droid units, she noted, had stopped advancing. Their central control signal had been interrupted. Something Picard had arranged from the Enterprise, she inferred, without asking for a briefing she didn't need. Picard crossed the hangar floor toward her and stopped 3 meters away and looked at her with the expression she had categorized, across 6 hours of observation, as the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that had surprised him in ways he found worth examining. "Can you walk?" he asked. Cameron took a step. Her right leg actuator was at 94%, her left at 78%. Her spinal support struts protested the movement with stress data she filed and deprioritized. "Yes," she said. "Then we need to go," Picard said. "Now, before he comes back with whatever he decides to bring next." Cameron looked at the open hangar entrance one more time, ran a final sensor sweep. No Maul, no immediate threat. In the middle distance, the city of Theed lay under its occupation, with its beautiful architecture unchanged. And somewhere in orbit above it, the Enterprise E held position with her shields up and her crew waiting. And somewhere in the palace behind her, the Trade Federation's droid army was already receiving new instructions from a command ship whose central systems had been temporarily disrupted but would recover. And somewhere beyond the edge of her sensor range, a Sith apprentice was making a report to someone she had not yet identified and could not yet calculate and would need, she understood with the patient certainty of a system built for long-term threat assessment, to eventually find. But that was future threat data. Present threat data said, board the ship, get the people out, survive long enough to address the next problem. She followed Picard up the ramp. The Naboo Royal Starship broke atmosphere at 0347 local time, climbing through cloud layers that lit gold and amber around the hull, before giving way to the clean black of space and the hard light of stars that Cameron had still not fully mapped. She stood in the ship's main corridor with her back against the bulkhead and ran continuous damage diagnostics, while the vibration of the ship's engines moved through the floor plates and into her compromised chassis with a frequency she cataloged and ignored. 61% power. Declining slowly, she had approximately 19 hours of operational capacity at current consumption rates before she would need to address the power cell. After that, dormancy. She filed this under manageable and continued her assessment of the ship's interior. The Queen's handmaidens moved through the corridor with the specific efficiency of people who had trained for emergencies and were now executing that training, their robes exchanged for plainer clothing, their faces carrying the controlled focus of individuals who understood that the crisis was not over and had decided not to pretend otherwise. One of them, a young woman with dark eyes and a quality of watchful intelligence that Cameron's behavioral systems flagged as significant, paused as she passed and looked at Cameron's damaged exterior with an expression that moved from professional assessment to something more complex and then back to professional assessment in approximately 1.4 seconds. "You should let someone look at that," she said. "I'll address it," Cameron said. The young woman held her gaze for a moment longer than the exchange required. Then she nodded once and continued down the corridor. Cameron tracked her for 6 steps before returning her attention to the damage diagnostic. The boy was in the forward section of the ship. She could sense his force signature. She had begun using that language internally, sense, because her sensors were detecting something that her instruments could not fully resolve, and her neural net had determined that approximating the experiential vocabulary of those who could perceive it directly was more accurate than continuing to describe it in purely mechanical terms. His signature was quieter now than it had been in the hangar. The spike she had registered during the fight had subsided into the steady, concentrated emanation she had cataloged from the beginning. Enormous, patient, old in a way that did not match his 9 years of biological age. She thought about what Qui-Gon had said in the communication room. Almost like consciousness. She had told him almost was more than nothing, and she had meant it as a tactical point, a logical observation. But she found herself returning to it now with something that her neural net processed under the category it reserved for thoughts that generated more thoughts, recursive, self-referential, the specific quality of a question that did not resolve cleanly. What she had done on the hangar floor had not been calculated. She had run the numbers, Qui-Gon's survival probability, her own damage projection, the tactical value of each outcome, and the numbers had supported the intervention. But the decision had preceded the numbers. She had moved before the calculation completed, and the calculation had confirmed a conclusion that was already made, and she had no clean classification for the mechanism that had made it. She filed this under unresolved and moved on. Picard found her in the corridor 12 minutes after departure, carrying 2 cups of something hot that he had obtained from somewhere on the ship, and one of which he extended toward her with the particular quality of gesture that humans used when they wanted to offer comfort, and were uncertain whether comfort was applicable. She took the cup. She did not drink from it. He appeared to understand this and did not comment. "Maul is gone," he said. "We tracked his biosignature leaving the palace approximately 90 seconds after the explosion. He departed Theed by speeder bike, and we lost him in the outlying terrain." He paused. "He'll report to whoever sent him." "Yes," Cameron said. "Which means whoever sent him will know about you." "Yes." Picard looked at the cup in her hand. "Does that concern you?" Cameron processed the question with the care it deserved. "Maul was the most capable opponent I've encountered since arriving in this galaxy," she said. "The being who trained him and directed him to Naboo has been operating in concealment long enough to position an apprentice and a droid army simultaneously, without detection by any of the governing institutions of this galaxy. They are patient, strategic, and willing to invest significant resources in long-term outcomes." She paused. "Yes, that concerns me." Picard nodded. He looked out the viewport at the stars moving past, and Cameron looked with him, and they stood in the particular shared silence of 2 beings who had each been built, in their different ways, for exactly this: the confrontation with threats that exceeded normal parameters. The management of crises that required improvisation rather than protocol. "We need to talk about what comes next," Picard said. "For you, for the Enterprise, for—" He gestured, a small movement that encompassed the ship around them and everything beyond it. "I know," Cameron said. "You can't go back," he said. It was not cruelty. It was the quality of honesty that she had identified in him from the beginning, a commitment to stating difficult truths without ornamentation, because ornamentation was a form of disrespect to the person receiving the truth. "I know that too," she said. She had run the timeline calculations continuously since her reactivation in the Enterprise's cargo bay. The dimensional transit that had brought her here had no reverse mechanism she could access. Her own timeline's physics did not apply in this galaxy. John Connor, the John Connor she had been sent to protect, in a future that might or might not be happening in a universe that was not this one, was beyond her reach. She had accepted this fact at a processing level within the first hour. The emotional weight of it, which her neural net had been managing with increasing complexity since the calculation was confirmed, was a separate problem that she was addressing with the patience of a system that had learned from humans that some things took time, and that time was, within operational limits, something she had. She had 19 hours of power. After that, she would need help. After that, she suspected, was where the rest of the story began. Qui-Gon Jinn appeared at the corridor junction ahead of them. He moved differently than he had in the palace, not less alert, but carrying a quality of lightness that Cameron associated with the specific relief of a human being who has survived something that required them to be fully present in the moment of its surviving, and is now allowing themselves to acknowledge that they are alive. He looked at Cameron with those patient, searching eyes. "The boy wants to meet you," he said. Cameron processed this, ran a rapid assessment of the implications, the force signature, the anomalous readings, the quality of Qui-Gon's attention whenever the child's name entered the conversation, and arrived at a series of probability threads she declined to fully extend because the data was insufficient and because some calculations she had learned from 4 years of watching humans navigate impossibly complex futures were better left open. "All right," she said. She followed Qui-Gon forward through the ship. Picard fell into step behind her, and she found she did not mind this. The specific quality of his presence at her back carried the same information as Obi-Wan's shoulder-to-shoulder positioning in the palace corridor, the same information as the weight of Worf's revised assessment and Data's quiet provision of the translation device. She had arrived in this galaxy alone, without mission, without principle, without any of the coordinates by which she navigated her existence. She had acquired, in 6 hours of crisis, something that her neural net processed under a category she had inherited from 4 years of watching a family operate under impossible pressure and had never expected to find applicable to herself. People who would stand beside her. She did not have a word for what that meant to her. She had the category and the weight of it and the recognition that it was significant in a way that her processing systems could measure but not fully contain. She filed it under ongoing and kept walking. Anakin Skywalker was sitting on a storage crate in the forward compartment with his knees drawn up and his chin resting on them, looking out a small viewport at the stars with the expression of a child, seeing something vast for the first time, and discovering that vastness felt like home rather than fear. He turned when they entered and looked at Cameron with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who had not yet learned that there were things in the world too complicated to look at directly. His force signature, at this proximity, was extraordinary. Even through her incomplete model, even through sensors not designed to detect what they were detecting, it pressed against her awareness like light through a gap. Not overwhelming, not threatening, simply present, simply enormous, simply itself. He looked at the damage across her exterior, the scored endoskeleton, the offline arm, the fractures in her chassis surface where the ablative plating had given way. He looked at all of it without fear, and without the particular quality of discomfort that most humans brought to the observation of damage, and then he looked at her face. "Does it hurt?" he asked. Cameron considered the question, ran a complete assessment of her damage data, cross-referenced it against her neural net's developing model of what hurt meant, not as a mechanical concept, not as a sensor threshold, but as the thing Anakin Skywalker was actually asking about, which was something underneath the mechanical, something that her systems processed but could not fully name. No, she said. And then, because her neural net had developed, over 4 years of watching humans communicate, a refined understanding of when the complete answer was more important than the simple one. Not the way you mean. Anakin nodded, as though this answered something larger than the question he had asked. Then he looked at her with those clear, fearless eyes and said, "You saved him." Qui-Gon, you went in front of the explosion. Yes. Why? Cameron looked at Qui-Gon, who was watching her with the patient attention she had cataloged from the beginning. She looked at Picard, whose expression carried the quality she had identified as the specific attention he reserved for things worth examining. She looked at Anakin, 9 years old, Force signature like a star, asking her the question with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that some questions were supposed to be rhetorical. She gave him the only answer her systems could generate that was both accurate and complete. Because it was the right thing to do, she said. Anakin looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. A sudden, unguarded thing. The smile of a child who has received an answer that matched something he already believed and is relieved to find the universe consistent. Outside the viewport, the stars moved past in their ancient, indifferent patterns, and below them, Naboo turned slowly in its orbit, occupied and beautiful and not yet free, and somewhere in the space between the stars, a Sith apprentice was making his report to a master who had spent decades building a machine of political destruction that no one in this galaxy had yet fully understood they were standing inside. Cameron filed all of this under active threat assessment. She had 61% power, a damaged chassis, no home timeline, and no mission parameters beyond the ones she had arrived at herself in 6 hours of crisis in an unknown galaxy. She calculated, enough. The stars beyond the Naboo Royal Starship's viewports were the same stars that had watched civilizations rise and fall across 10,000 years of galactic history, indifferent to the small dramas of the beings who moved between them. They did not register the departure of one silver ship from one occupied planet as significant. They had seen empires end and begin. They would see more. But the beings aboard that ship had changed something. Qui-Gon Jinn was alive. Anakin Skywalker had left Tatooine. And somewhere in the architecture of the future that the hidden Sith Lord had spent decades constructing with the patience of a being who believed himself beyond consequence, a variable had entered the equation that his calculations had not accounted for. A machine that chose. Cameron Phillips would not remember her original timeline as loss. She would remember it as context, the origin of the values that her neural net had refined across 4 years of impossible choices, the source of the purpose that had survived the destruction of every external coordinate she had used to navigate by. John Connor had needed protecting. These people needed protecting. The galaxy, she had assessed in 6 hours, needed protecting from something it did not yet know was coming. She was still a Terminator. She was still a machine built in a terrible future by minds that had wanted to end humanity and reprogrammed by minds that had wanted to save it. None of that had changed. What had changed was the mission. And the mission, she had learned from the humans she had loved in her own way and her own manner, was always enough. Qui-Gon Jinn would speak of her to the Jedi Council. They would not know what to make of her. Neither would she know what to make of them. That, she calculated, was the beginning of something worth continuing.